Hello, my name is Tylluan. I'm a solitary pagan witch, and that funny noise then was my dog Little Ord. I'm a solitary pagan witch, I'm an author and the founder of the Wolf and Howl Press. Don't know whether you can see it yet, but what I'm holding in my hand and what that funny noise was about with Audrey earlier, she was leaping up to see what this is. It is, believe it or not, a rather droopy nettle, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But since it's already stung me quite badly a couple of times, I'm just going to put it down on the table. Right, okay. The humble nettle. What are its magical properties and how do we find them? You see, I'm a great believer that magic comes from our relationship with the world around us. It's not a question of go to a book of spells and use this herb and that herb and find exotic ingredients and things like that. I believe some of the strongest magic comes from the simplest ingredients. And the nettle is a great example of this. The word nettle probably has the same etymology, the same source as the word needle. And naden, which is an old word for to sew. And the reason I say this is because actually as a nettle gets older, the stalks get very stringy. And years ago, people used to take these stringy bits off and they used to make cloth. Nettle cloth was used for sheets. Not for fine quality garments or anything, but for sheets, certainly. And that's an interesting thing because we think of needles, they're sharp, they're pointy, stick them in us and they hurt. And of course, a nettle stings, as I can tell you today. It stung me right across here. So what does that tell us? Well, why would a plant sting? It would sting basically to prevent itself from being eaten. That's its biggest threat, being eaten, being picked. It hasn't got a down on mankind, it's just what it does. So you could say, well, it would be very good in cases of psychic self-defense because it stings, it pushes things away. In the same principle as thorny plants like roses and brambles were used in driving away evil, driving away harm, protecting things. So the nettle can be used the same way. Now the interesting thing about nettles though is that when they're dry, they don't sting hardly at all, which is when they're fed to cattle because it's supposed to increase the milk yield. So you could say that by blunting the sting of the nettle, it could be used in spells to promote reconciliation, to bring people together, because the sting, the hostility has gone. And that terrific sigh then was not Mr. Penry falling asleep in the corner, that was Homer, the basset hound. He's just had a dish of treats and he's snoring very happily. I've had to actually, because there's so much about the nettle, I've actually had to write it down so I don't forget anything. So if I refer down to this, you know what I'm doing. So we've got that first of all. The other thing about nettles, they're great opportunists. I mean, that is a massive nettle. It's about 1 metre high where it's growing. It's growing in a pot where I had this shrub that died. They're tremendous opportunists, and they will often grow on old compost heaps, things like that. In fact, you can always tell where there's been a human settlement because you will almost always find a crop of nettles there. How do we use this magically? Well, I think the opportunistic element, the element of making the most of things. If we have a spell where we really want to make the most of our chances, nettles are great to put in the magical mix. You mightn't necessarily think of a nettle first of all, but I think it's a great plant for that. Another thing about nettles, when I went out to cut it, you do have to cut them down. They're almost impossible to break. Now this is partly due to the way that they have these stringy bits in the stems. But the stem of a nettle is very hard to break. You have to cut it. That's tenacity, that's strength. A spell where you want strength, where you want to hold on in the face of adversity. Nettles are great because that's what they do. Nettle tops are slightly different. I mean, when I was a kid, we used to be able to take them off with a little thin piece of stick, you know, just go out and like that, take the top of the nettle off, stop it growing. And of course, another thing is that when you, years ago, people would they'd actually eat nettles, and they taste awful. And they would make nettle tea because it was supposed to purify the blood. So, one thing about picking nettles for human consumption, if you're going to do that, you want to aim for the top couple of inches of the plant. The lower leaves rather, the toxins can build up a little bit in the leaves. So if you're going to actually consume them for tea, take the top off. And again, you see, for purification, and we're going to, in this series of videos, we're actually going to talk about house blessings, which involve purification. And nettles are great for purification. They can be used to purify us within, with the rather unpleasant tasting nettle tea. Put a spoonful of honey in is the best. Or you can use it, make a mixture. You can purify lots of things. You can purify yourself by putting some nettles, or nettle tea is better, in the bath water. Or you can use it and take it round and splash everywhere to purify an area you're working in, or to purify a room. Hang on a tick, let me see if I've forgotten anything, because I almost certainly have. Oh yes. The only other thing that I really wanted to mention is this business about making nettle cloth. The fact that you can use it to spin cloth. One of the other plants, obviously, that we get, where you get cloth from it, is linen. And when you can make cloth, it is magical, because cloth has the ability to conceal things. I don't mean an invisibility cloak or anything like that. I mean simple things. You put a tablecloth on the table. I put a tablecloth on my table to hide the big burn mark from Mr. Penry's candlestick, which is another story. But it hides things, it conceals things. So for magic intended to conceal, again, nettle could be very useful, particularly if you are brave and manage to pull out some of the stringy bits. Very good idea. And that's really about it. You know, I hope I've given you a few ideas. I'm sorry we're not out in the garden doing this, which is where we intended to be, but unfortunately the council are digging up the road again. So we can't do that, it's too noisy. But anyway, I hope I've given you a few ideas, how we use things, what we do. And good luck with it, have fun, experiment. Be careful with nettles, if they sting like mine do, they're quite something. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.